on this. So we're going to be live in just a minute. Okay, so we're live. Welcome everyone. Just give us a few minutes for everybody to come in into the webinar. This is a conversation on wearing the niqab. It's really a conversation that is timely and past due. And hopefully it's going to be a discussion. We have a number of people that are attending, as well as will be broadcast on Facebook Live and then shared into YouTube as well. This is Dr. Hatem Bazian from IRDP and Islamophobia Studies Center, and both Near Eastern Studies and Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. So this is part of our ongoing conversations, events, and engagement to try to continue to really plow the field, both of Islamophobia as well as a whole host of other subjects. Last week, we had a conversation with Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. Prior to that, we focused on the Bosnian genocide with the 25th year anniversary of Srebrenica. So this is a continuation of the conversation in that regard. Just house cleaning. If you would like to ask questions, there is a question and answer section. So if you want to put your question in there as we get into the conversation, do that. I have a set of questions that to spring the conversation forward and as informal process as possible. So this is not I got you type of an engagement, but rather to actually explore the topic. So I'm really, it's a pleasure to have with us Dr. Anna Piela as a visiting scholar at Northwestern University in Illinois. She has previously worked in the UK as a research consultant with Muslim Women's Council at Bradford and lecturer in religious studies at Leeds Trinity University. Her book, which is just about to be out in the market, if it's not already out there already, it's titled Wearing the Niqab, Muslim Women in the UK and the US. And it's actually will be published, but it's published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2021. So it's actually, I know that you finished the monograph, it's now in the production cycle. So maybe I'll just finish your question. Just give us how did you get into this topic? Every book has a story and every word has a story. So what is the story behind it?
The book really is a continuation of my long-standing interest in Islam and gender. My PhD, which I completed in 2010, was about Muslim women's discussions in online forums about Islamic prescriptions and different interpretations of Islam and how they're applied to everyday life. And yeah, prior to that, I got interested in Islam when I spent some time in Turkey. And I wrote my master's dissertation on the Greek-Turkish conflict over the Aegean Islands, the Aegean seashells. But the part that interested me the most was the social parts, how the minorities coexist in both countries. So yeah, I mean, that sort of developed slowly. And I moved from a very traditional sort of political science background to sort of a women's studies / Islamic studies thing, very much sort of focused on ethnography and lived experience of religion.
Now, in the book, you say wearing the niqab, and in the introduction or as you discuss, you try to navigate the use of terminology, that use of whether it's is niqab or burqa, and terminology is very important. So what is the distinction between the use of the term niqab versus now the more frequently used term burqa? And each one of these terms has its own genealogy as well as deployment in the public discourse. So how do you approach trying to define the language and at least ground some of your work, niqab or burqa, and what is the difference?
So yeah, that was one of the sort of misnomers that has irked me since the beginning of my work on this book. That the media uses the term burqa indiscriminately, especially in the sort of another term in burqa ban. Mm-hmm. But burqa is an outfit that's worn almost exclusively in the subcontinent, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and we see that particular outfit very rarely in the sort of generally understood West. And I have a whole discussion about the term West in the book as well, but just to say that, you know, it's obviously a term with a very long colonial sort of ideology behind it. And that seems to have sort of flown into the deployment of burqa and niqab. But my own theory is, you know, after having done some research, is that the burqa seems to be more, it seems to irk the secular sensibilities more because it covers up the eyes. And there has been a long sort of history of engagement with masks and veils in Europe. And people who wore masks and people who wore veils in the public space were very often disliked and resented by authorities because they were seen as sort of escaping morality and escaping responsibility. So even though the niqab does not generally cover up the eyes, usually just covers up the lower part of the face in the version that we see in the UK or in the US.
Is the term, for me, is the term niqab was far more prior to 9/11 being used in Western discourse versus the burqa, or do we see the burqa used as a term prior to that? Because my sense is that the terminology of the burqa corresponds to the US engagement in Afghanistan. So it becomes the language of currency. I don't know if any of your research at least arrived to that.
Yeah, there definitely is that sort of temporal boundary on the use of burqa. To be honest, neither of these outfits was very much in the media focus prior to 2001, 9/11. There is some very occasional mention of purda in relation to Pakistani and Afghani traditions, but really burqa and niqab, both of them sort of came onto the scene, both media and academic scene after 9/11. So and burqa especially because of the involvement in Afghanistan, the invasion.
Now, your research for this book was actually interviewing both women in the US and in the UK who wear the niqab, burqa, and in essence, it's a qualitative study. So what was the methodology that you approached, and what were at least some of the questions and the responses that you got from your participants?
So my methodology was grounded in the sort of feminist academic background that I had. You know, with the background in women's studies, I was very much tuned into centering women's voices, the minority voices, to the extent that I could, because feminist research always emphasizes that as a researcher we are limited. We have our own sort of limited vision, and you know, there's only so far that we can go, in order to understand somebody else's experience. And so saying out loud in the research, in the methodology, that, you know, for example, I am white, I'm of Christian background. I am, you know, with an academic background. All these things give me a privilege that I need to acknowledge and sort of work actively on, so that I can, at every stage, I can think how it could bias me, instead of saying that I am going to be just objective. That's the approach that seems to be a little bit outdated. But in my PhD, there was a huge chapter on methodology and my own position and how it may be biased, and what I'm doing to sort of address it. And so I carried this over to the research on the niqab, especially that women who wear the niqab are silenced in the public space. They're not allowed to advocate for themselves, and even if they speak, they're not listened to. That's something that I noticed. That if they're included in media sort of engagement, usually they're completely crowded out by detractors. So my idea was to just put them at the center stage and really make the interviews as informal as possible. I had some questions, I had some ideas, what I would like to find out, but I remember that they have to create the agenda for the interview with me. So just one example of that, one of my interviewees represented a group in Islam called the Ahmadiyya. Mm-hmm. And so I came to the interview thinking I'm going to interview this woman, I'm going to find out about her experiences, but she had her own agenda, which was to educate me about experiences of Ahmadiyya Muslims globally, and how they're discriminated against. So it was a really nice example of how we both achieved our goals sort of collaboratively. And my questions, or the issues, the general issues I wanted to find about was how the women I spoke with framed the practice of wearing the niqab in a religious way. So what kind of Islamic arguments they're using. And as a scholar of religious studies, I was really interested what kind of definition of religion I'll be able to sort of derive from those narratives. The second general issue that I explored was the social consequences of wearing the niqab. So how these women speak about the niqab with non-Muslim audiences, and how they approach the practice. Is it dynamic? Is it related to the context they're in? Do they ever take it off? And what guides them? And then finally, the whole aspect of media representation and how they respond to it. That's actually the section of media studies that's growing recently, but there's not much research actually on the responses of Muslims to media representations of Muslims. So these people actually know how they're represented, and they have feelings and reflections and thoughts about it, and I was really interested in those as well. So those were kind of general sort of areas, but I didn't keep the questions exactly the same in every interview. It was very free-flowing.
I know that the work on women wearing the niqab is really very thin. So the literature is very thin in the field of Islamic studies and so on. So how does the field of writing and research on Muslim women wearing the niqab? There are some the literature as a result of the French ban and the Montreal or the Quebec, but it's an external literature rather than a literature that actually in the voice of women themselves. So how did you find the research or the existing research in the field? My sense, knowing what is being written, there's very limited writing specifically in the voice and in the examination of women in niqab being the primary focus of the research. Mm-hmm. And the question for me is, does that point to a form of latent Orientalism, latent Islamophobia, that they are to be spoken about, but not actually to be allowed to speak in this sense?
So I think that the niqab really represents a sort of limit of the secular liberal sensibility of how the West is able to perceive itself. It's the limit of tolerance, and the woman wearing the niqab really has become the symbol of, and I'm using inverted commas, you know, the bad Muslim, so the extremist, or the victim of being forced by patriarchal sort of authority to cover up. But yeah, it was that lack of engagement with women who wear the niqab, with women who choose to wear the niqab, I should say, that directly triggered this research, because in 2013, you know, the UK was going through another sort of news cycle where niqab was sort of at the center, and I was really interested in what these women have to say. You know, with a women's studies background, I was less interested in, you know, every politician's opinion or every journalist than the women themselves. So I was looking through all the media, progressive media, and centrist, and then I went to the academic literature hoping to find something, but at the time when I started the research, there was nothing that would represent this kind of insider perspective, with one exception, which was a report, but that was a France-based report, which was commissioned by the Open Societies Foundation, and that was published before the French ban. So that was the only source that I could find that had like several women who were interviewed, but nothing in the UK or United States. So I thought, you know, this is the moment where, you know, if there is no book, if the book that I want to read is not there, then I have to write that book. And it was just, you know, a good time, I think, to start it. And it took me 7 years to finish. But over the 7 years, I guess my apparatus has grown, in the sense that I moved from the United Kingdom to the United States, and I included this context in the research as well. And the United States as a cultural sort of milieu represents and, you know, offers its own big questions that, you know, I was able to include in the final book. So that, I think, was very helpful.
Yeah. Now, in I think it's chapter 1, you speak about niqabi women wanting to have agency and represent themselves, and we get into the whole notion of representation, looking at Edward Said's work of Orientalism and representation. So what are the frames that are attempted to be countered in self-representation? And in that discourse, are they responding to the frames that are placed upon them rather than representing their own self without having to respond to this? It's a difficult question. What was like the respondents in terms of representation? What was their feedback? What answers have you gleaned from those interviews?
Well, that was, it was my goal to avoid a situation where I'm only framing, or when the conversation is framed just by those external, hostile, conflictual frameworks, because you know, that's basically just putting that agenda on the whole research and its findings. But at the same time, I recognize that you know, all the research, all the communication that we have is kind of dialogical, so we cannot escape the context. So I settled on having a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, you know, women themselves, even when they were not directly asked, they referred to those Orientalist frameworks. So they referred to stereotypical representations of them. And they said, you know, and then they said how untrue these representations are. But to say that something is untrue, then, you know, first you need to give the sort of the foundation of that. So that's, that was one side of it. But like I said, I was really interested in the religious sort of aspect of it. And at first, the women I spoke with were very reluctant to engage in that religious dialogue, in the religious narrative. They talked a lot about how the niqab is beneficial in social terms. And it was, you know, it was usually sort of towards the end of the conversation how, you know, when they were able to glean that I'm not going to limit their narrative, then, you know, they kind of slowly, I could say, opened up, in the sense that, you know, they knew that I was not going to dismiss that religious discourse, and you know, and they started talking about, you know, their religious experience, and you know, how they understand piety and connection with God, and they talked to me about Islamic history, and you know, which hadith they understand as, you know, sort of foundational for the practice. So in that sense, I think it's possible to sort of generate that that insider narrative, but it takes time, and a sort of building of trust and rapport in a research situation where, you know, I am a non-Muslim, so they really, even though they talked with me before the interview, they really couldn't be certain what my attitude would be to this very sort of religious, pious discourse. And that was, for me, that was the most interesting part, I guess.
Yeah. Now, in one of the chapters, you discuss about the religious discourse within Islam, trying to navigate Islamic law and so on. And maybe it's a larger question that we could delve into, that the debate about the niqab is both internal to within the Muslim society. So you'll find the majority of Muslims actually saying that niqab is not part of Islam. That's an argument that you see. While some of the women who were in the niqab, basing on one of the schools of thought, saying it is part of Islam. And then you have the political, secular world, France, UK, Canada, who actually resort to asking some Muslim majority countries' opinion to limit and define what is religious and what's not. So did any of your respondents actually convey this type of discourse in your interviews? Like, I remember in the debate in France, when they had the ban on the burqa, they sought the opinion of Al-Azhar in Egypt. So in this sense, the French government was attempting to define the scope of religious freedom of its citizens based on the opinion of an external religious authority. So was that part of the discussion, or did not come through?
Oh, it did. Of course it did. And you know, just to make a note about the French government, I think the really interesting part of that is that the French government treated Islam as Christianity. So they missed the part that not every religion is constructed in the same way. And so, for example, you know, if we take Catholicism, the main French, you know, the main religion in France, the most common one, you know, there's a pope at the top. It's very hierarchical, and the pope's pronouncements are law. And so here the French government treated Al-Azhar as a kind of, you know, Vatican.
And Marie Le Pen actually went down there to get their blessings for.
And that's
which is like not an oxymoron, it's beyond an oxymoron, where she externalizes the Muslim population in France, yet she seeks the intervention of a Muslim religious authority from outside in the affairs of France.
And so, you know, there was a major misunderstanding, fundamental misunderstanding, that Islam is not as hierarchical, or the hierarchy is not vertical as it is in Catholicism. It's more of a horizontal hierarchy with so many different sects and branches, and people who may be following a scholar and people who may not, and who, you know, who follow their own interpretation of Islam. So you just cannot, you cannot make pronouncements about religion in general using a sort of mental structure that is derived from one religion, because it's inevitably going to be, you know, not reflecting reality of that other religion. And so women who I spoke with never said that the niqab is obligatory, because you said you use the term a part of Islam, and I think it's kind of important to make a distinction between something being obligatory and not disputed, and something that is beneficial or allowed. And so the women said, it's not obligatory. I don't have to do it. I choose to do it because, you know, it's recommended. So that's actually, that distinction has its place in Islamic law. And so the women I spoke to said, I choose to do it because that's my particular way of connecting with God, and it helps me to develop my sort of religious disposition and my piety, but somebody else might be doing it in a completely different way. And so they were at pains to express that they don't have a judgmental attitude towards others. And yeah, I mean, one of the examples I remember was somebody who has a lot of tattoos. They said, you know, if there's somebody completely covered with tattoos sitting next to me on the subway, you know, I accept that person, but, you know, I also, I would like in return to be accepted because, you know, I'm covered by fabric. And so that's just kind of a basic idea and principle of sort of equality to them. And so, yeah, I mean, they referred to all those arguments that try to construct the niqab as not Islamic, but yeah, that's kind of an internal debate within Islam, because to everybody, you know, the definition of religion is a little bit different here, and so everybody has a different agenda, and I speak about that in the book as well. That for some, the dismissal of the niqab is kind of a sort of banner of I'm a very liberal, good, and assimilated Muslim. There is a group of people who sort of dismiss the niqab sort of to achieve that status. And so, yeah, these women are in a very sort of precarious position because in many ways they are dismissed by their faith community. Not all of it, but there is a sizable group that dismisses the niqab. And then there of course, there's a prejudice against them from the non-Muslim majority in the UK and the United States. So
yeah, I know for a fact that there are some Muslims, just doing my own work and my own writing, that some Muslims who want to be assimilated and integrated in the West, there is nothing more problematic for them than actually having a Muslim woman in a niqab in civil society space, because it put them to answer those questions, because now the whole discourse of representation of Muslim as the other become quintessentially represented by the Muslim woman in a niqab in there. So did you, at least from your own work, how did that come out in women's responses to some of your interviews?
So the fact that they're not accepted by other Muslims who sort of appear more liberal, is that?
Well, some Muslims who want to assimilate and integrate, especially in the West, they view the niqab, again, saying that it is not part of Islam. You will see that refrain, as well as they almost recoil themselves. And I tend to describe it as a form of internalized Islamophobia, because that, since the media, the public discourse, the political discourse has focused on the niqabi Muslim woman as the bad Muslim representation, because in here she doesn't have an agency, she is completely covered, most likely her male overseer, the husband, the father are the ones who are forcing. So all that discourse, so Muslims who want to appear that they are in essence assimilated, integrated, and they have arrived into liberal society, that this in essence becomes their own response to it is also negative.
Yeah, that sort of attitude was evidenced in both the British and American narratives. I remember one respondent from the UK who said she was disowned by her family, and she basically said, you know, her family were sort of aspiring to this middle class, educated, very liberal position in society, with, you know, kids playing the piano. I remember that particular sort of example from her. And she said they just could not stomach her putting on the niqab and sort of focusing on pious life. So that was the British example. On the American side, I remember a Jewish American convert who said, people in the supermarket or in public spaces, people who are obviously Muslim, they pretend she does not exist. They do not return the salams, which is quite offensive, because you're supposed to return salams to a fellow Muslim. So she said she feels very much sort of dismissed and silenced and invisible, and she felt she was suffering, especially as a convert, because she did not have a sort of an ethnic community behind her, so she was seeking out those connections sort of out externally.
Now, in one area that I try to focus on is in particular violent attacks on Muslim women, but also attacks on Muslim women with the niqab. Islamophobic attacks tend to actually be higher toward Muslim women than men. So in many of the data, 80% of attacks in France and the US is similarly target Muslim women. Did any of your respondent in the question express the violence that they experience as wearing the niqab in public space, in the subway, on the bus? And how is the response of others? Do people come to their aid? Or in essence, it's a double almost violence, the violence of not recognizing this violence and the violence of not responding to actually coming to their aid. Did you get any of this in your interviews?
So narratives of people coming to their aid were very rare. I can think of one or two women, but the very, very sort of common situation is that a harasser or an attacker will pick a situation where a woman is on her own. So maybe at a bus stop or an empty street, or maybe driving. So when she's driving on her own in the car, and so she is faced with sort of challenging that attacker on her own. And yeah, I mean, very often that happens when women are out with kids. So that's an additional very harmful sort of aspect of how such an attack may traumatize kids, sometimes as young as 1 or 2 years old. The thing that I did not expect in the data was that the harassment is very often racialized and sexualized. And because this sort of stereotypical thing is that somebody will pull a niqab off, but I guess because such an attack is directed specifically at the woman, because it is very sort of specific. If you wear the niqab, you cannot pass as anything else. You are very obviously a Muslim woman, and so women perceive that to some extent as a very sort of sexualized attack. And one of my respondents said that to her it was the act of having her niqab pulled off was like sexual harassment in the street. And she said it was very sort of similar because she had experienced sexual harassment before, and it was exactly the same reaction she had in her body, shaking and feeling sort of polluted by that situation. A very interesting. So it is a very interesting thing how women sort of cope with that, because they have coping strategies, and so a lot of women are very tuned into their social surroundings, and it must be very sort of psychologically draining to always scan your environment and see if there is a potential threat. But that's what you need to do to survive. So some of them put on and take off the niqab based on their perception of how safe the location is. And you know, is it local? Is it the city center? Is it empty, or are there other people? So they do that. But a lot of their strategies reminded me of strategies that women are sort of socialized into, you know, to avoid sexual harassment. So, for example, diffusing a situation, you know, appearing, you know, addressing the potential attacker, addressing the person who is behaving in a strange way. So, you know, talking to them just to sort of make that connection. It's, you know, it is an incredible burden. So yeah, I mean, I call that building bridges, although, you know, to what extent you can build bridges with people who pose danger to you, it's of course, you know, debatable. But yeah, I mean, they do that also in situations where I guess it makes sense to educate. So, you know, one woman described in Scotland, described a situation where she addressed some teenagers who were just kind of running around her, and she didn't quite know what to make of it. So she was Scottish, she was a convert to Islam, and she, you know, she started talking with them, and they were very surprised that she spoke to them with a Scottish accent. And, you know, they started asking her questions about Islam, and you know, they had a lot of misconceptions. So they said, oh, you know, if you take that thing off, are they going to cut off your hand? You know, a complete sort of mishmash of misconceptions. But she was actually able to give them some facts, and you know, they were very happy with it. They were kids, and then they just ran off. So in that sense, we can say, you know, it was an educational moment for those kids that she gave them. But I'm sure not every encounter is so, you know, is so benign. That there are encounters that leave these women very shaken. And I didn't come across examples of severe physical harm, but there are other researchers in the UK who describe things like, you know, women being beaten up, kicked in the pregnant stomach, cigarette stubs thrown at them. So, you know, all sorts of terrible stuff that, you know, should not happen in society. And yeah, I mean, on the American side, it's necessary to mention that it was very much, you know, it was the racial dynamic that came into play. I did interview several African American Niqabis who told me that, you know, for them, for example, taking the Niqab off doesn't necessarily offer protection like it might do to other women, to non-Black women, because you know, they emphasize that, you know, in America it is the Black identity that you know is targeted. So, you know, they may take off the Niqab, but they will still be Black, and they may still, you know, they may experience anti-Black racism instead of Islamophobia. So, you know, it's kind of a hard choice to make. You know, do you want to experience this particular prejudice or another one? So that really complicated, you know, the issues for women who were Black, because they could not use the race to their advantage, as for example the white converts could, who could just take off the niqab. And, you know, for example, I remember a Latino niqabi who used to take off her niqab, and suddenly the assumptions that were made about her when she was wearing only the hijab, the headscarf, was that she was perhaps a nun, and, you know, she looked like Virgin Mary, you know, by other, you know, by fellow Latinos. So she was able to play that to her advantage here. But so it was a really important factor in how women perceived and kind of negotiated the social surroundings.
So you find there's a distinction between the niqabi wearing women in the UK versus the US, and what other differences have you been able to identify, in both in terms of the societal dynamics as well as how they are located in the broader discourses?
To be honest, I was surprised by how many similarities there were between the British and the American context. And I guess, you know, the majority of research and writings on niqab have been about France and Canada, because that's where the niqab was very early sort of banned, and it was present within the social sort of discourse. Not so much in the UK or the United States, because there has not been an official ban, but even though the legal systems are different, there's an incredibly similar way in which freedom of religion is perceived. So in the UK, it's the European Convention of Human Rights. That, it's Article 9 that talks about religious freedom and how the freedom of religion as, freedom of conscience, that's very kind of internalized, it cannot be limited, but expressions of that religion, sort of material expressions, may be limited based on several factors. And in the United States, it's the First Amendment, and it's a very similar perception. So it is the internal, the belief cannot be limited, but the external sort of the demonstration of that belief is subject to limitations, and that was visible very much in the sort of landmark legal cases that involved the niqab. I discussed several of them in the book, and somehow they all were related to school, to the educational settings, where the student usually wanted to wear the niqab, and the school opposed that intention, so the student would sue. And in two landmark British cases, the judge dismissed that claim, and the students were not allowed to wear the niqab. But in the American situation, actually the judge they granted the right to wear the niqab to the student, and it was the school who had to change the regulations to allow for the niqab to be a part of the of the, not the uniform, but part of the attire. And so that was an interesting distinction. But then there were two landmark cases that were outside of the educational sort of context. And one of they were related to, I think, the driving license, and
the case in Florida.
Yes, the case in Florida, Freeman versus DMV. And that was interesting because there was this woman who was able to get a photograph wearing the niqab for her license. She first lived in Illinois, then she lived in Florida. And 3 months after 9/11, the Department of Motor Vehicles contacted her and said, you need to have a picture showing your face. And so, she sued them, and she was unsuccessful, I believe. But they attempted to make those sort of theological distinctions and definitions. The judge basically engaged in theological activity, even though they were not prepared, or they were not in a position to do that. So yeah, that's quite a common occurrence in relation to niqab, with witnesses being brought that sort of unsurprisingly will testify that the niqab is not a part of Islam, and the claimant does not need to wear it, where really it is such a very private choice, and nobody can really sort of say that this is a part of your religion or not. If you choose to experience and live your religion that way, this is your right. And so yeah, that was unconstitutional in that case, in Freeman versus DMV.
I'm trying to remember this thing. I think the European Union Human Rights Commission did not extend protection of women wearing the niqab or the hijab in relations to employment, but you could correct me. I'm trying to remember the case I read. So there is a distinction in terms of European-wide Human Rights Commission as it pertains to the issue of wearing the niqab and even the hijab in some cases. Am I correct, or?
You are correct. And again, like I say, there's a wide scope for sort of decision making in that regard, and it's left to judges basically. So yeah, I mean, there cannot be restrictions placed on the belief, but the expression of the belief, very much so. And so even though in countries like the UK, where there is no outright ban on the niqab, and in theory, women are free to wear it, specific judges in specific situations will have a great deal of power in deciding whether a woman is allowed to wear it, at work or at school or in court. So that's an interesting sort of situation. And it's very, one of those cases that I mentioned, the first landmark UK case called, that was brought in by Sabina Begum in 2006. It's really sort of a delineation in sentencing, because, or in those rulings, because up till 2006, when that case was filed, the rulings were usually very sort of liberal, in that judges were much more open to leaving women the power to decide. After that, they were much more restrictive. So that's a very sort of important moment in the British niqab history.
Now let me go down to another chapter of yours, which is Muslim niqabi wearing women that attempting to translate their positionality, their existence to the secular world. And so what were some of the strategies that are used in translating the niqab into a secular society? And I have a subtext to that question, because in here you have to engage in some form of performative engagement. And therefore, how to delineate that your own engagement does not become a performance rather than an authentic self being there. And again, I'm putting a lot on you to try to read into the respondents. But what are some of those elements that showed their translation of their niqab wearing to the secular world?
So I really like that chapter, because I think that chapter really shows how well placed these women are to be in the secular liberal sphere, because they are able to use that language of rights and freedoms to their advantage. And they have to be very adept at recognizing the limitations of their audiences. And they do so, when they speak to people who may not be Muslim, who may not understand that religious discourse that is central for them. Instead, they have to sort of translate their religious sentiment into discourses that will be intelligible. So that also requires, incredible fluency in switching these registers, and that was admirable. So yeah, I mean, women said to me that openly, that a lot of the time, either people don't understand or they don't want to understand the religious argumentation they're trying to make, simply because, perhaps words like piety or God in the secular sphere kind of have lost their currency. They're not heard in some ways. So yeah, they engage in different strategies to be seen, I guess. In words and discourses that will be easily read by others, and sometimes, it was quite a strong common example. Humor, somebody will be, engaging in banter with them, and one of the women said, "Oh, I just say that when it's cold, at least my nose doesn't freeze off. It's really helpful." And of course, that's almost flippant, but in a sense, she not only sort of butts off that question, or gives some sort of answer that was apparently satisfactory to the person who was just, talking, just killing time. They were waiting for something at work. But at the same time, she shows that she can be fun. She can joke, and that's quite important social capital in our society. To show that you can be fun, and you can engage with someone in that sense. So again, it's quite a lot of effort, because you never know how that will go.
Well, comedy have always been used as a, as a form of defense, defending oneself and responding to attacks. And the fact that they're deploying it is something speaks of the need to do so because of the normal patterns of negative rejection, attacks, targeting. So you comedy as or laughter and responding in such a way, I would say, is normative. One could look at the long history of targeted communities that used comedy as a way both to laugh at their attackers, but also to humanize themselves in that sense.
Yeah, I guess just the only difference here is that a stand-up comedian on a stage we can assume that they're physically safe. These women kind of engage in that comedy on, like, out there.
I'm just saying that the tool of comedy or laughter as a defensive mechanism is present historically.
Yeah. So moving on from that, one other very interesting sort of strategy was to deploy examples from Christianity, and the references were made to most often the Virgin Mary and her veil, and the question how Virgin Mary is venerated across churches, Catholic churches, and at the same time the hijab would not be acceptable. Another woman said, what about Michelle Obama and all other female visitors to the Pope, heads of state who cover their heads? That seems to be quite acceptable. So there's that sort of parallel that they're able to deploy to sort of to ask why, why is head covering in one religion acceptable and another it's kind of unintelligible and perceived as foreign. And one other interesting strategy was to bring up health benefits of the niqab, and two sides to that. One sort of strand was protecting mental health, and some women said wearing the niqab just really eased their panic attacks and bouts of anxiety they had. So they wore that for that reason. And some other women claimed that the niqab protected them from infections. So that's actually one aspect of niqab wearing that has gained incredible popularity in the recent few months. During the pandemic, a lot of major media outlets have been exploring, the similarities and differences between the niqab and the mask, and saying, is the niqab as protective as the mask, and things like that. So even though the scientific research, medical research is quite unclear about that, it depends on the consistency of niqab wearing and the actual fabric that the niqab is made of. A lot of these women said, when they're in the public, they avoid, by wearing the niqab, they avoid breathing in pathogens. So that was a very sort of interesting rationalization of a religious practice that, worked very well with a lot of people. And so that was a very sort of effective, because it appealed to common sense and, to the sort of scientific rational logic. So in that sense, they were very sort of perceptive by using that and assessing that could work. I'm trying to remember. Well, of course,
mechanisms has its own what you call drawbacks, because if it's at the beginning the assertion that this is for religious purposes, then it's part of the translation, but does create the contradictions.
Well, the reasons could be multiple. It doesn't necessarily mean that the religious reason excludes all others. It's just, like I said, it's kind of translated. The other the other strategies or reasons or motivations, which may be much less important to the woman in question, are sort of are emphasized because they're more intelligible. So women will appeal to the to the way that Western subjects want to see themselves as multicultural and open to difference. And so there's a lot of stuff about cosmopolitanism, and so how women who wear the niqab are necessary to create that diverse society. And so of course not everybody who's sort of located in the West these days will be an advocate of that argument, but it's an argument that appeals to at least the liberal progressive sectors that claim difference is important. It's just is it only some kinds of difference that are important, or are we more open, and are we open-minded as to what kind of difference we're going to accept? That's the question. And of course, one really important strategy that that sort of appealed to me, for example, very much as a feminist, was that of women the wearing the niqab as a critique of gender relations in the West. That was incredibly incredibly common in the narratives, that women basically said, I don't want to be seen, I don't want to show my body, and I completely support the right of other women to wear miniskirts and bikinis, but I want those women to support my right to wear the niqab, because it's just the way I feel comfortable, to cover up. I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be judged on my sexual attractiveness. So that was a very, very interesting argument. That's sometimes is dismissed because that argument is sometimes used as normative by conservative factions in Islam. So, conservative factions will say a woman has to cover, to not show her sexual attributes. And everybody else who does not do that, is sinning. So I want to emphasize that these women did not engage in that sort of argumentation. They were very much about, this is my body, this is my right to cover it up, just as others have the right to uncover theirs.
Yeah. And we're not saying that there aren't cases where people actually try to mandate the niqab. So that's a different discussion for a different point. In here, I wanted to go possibly to questions after my last questions to you, so we could get some of our audience. What are the next pieces of research that needs to be done on in this area? Are there other questions that needs to be explored? And I'm looking here both from my own students and individuals who want to engage in research. What are some of the pressing questions, specifically in the space of women's wearing the niqab or the positionality of niqab in secular society, the situation in France, in Quebec? You also wrote the chapter on Islamophobia in Poland. So just thinking about what are those lines of questions that might spring new research based on your work?
So I feel that that I have used my data efficiently in the sense that personally, looking at my data set, at this point, I want to have that sense of completion. But at the same time, a subject is never finished. However, with the niqab and in Islamic dress, women's dress in general, I think it's really important to leave that behind to some extent. And I'm just saying that maybe a little bit facetiously, but if we focus on the niqab and the hijab, and forever, if we forever talk about how that is important in many ways, I think we're missing out on so many other really important aspects of these women's lives. So, these women happen to be wearing the niqab, but they are, incredible experts in so many fields, and they have talents and skills, and they're journalists, scientists, and mothers, and homemakers, and teachers. And so I think it's kind of time to move on just from Denicab and look at what are the issues and challenges facing Muslim women teachers. What about race? Islam and race. That's something that definitely is such a strong direction in future research. What legislation what legislation needs to be addressed in order to improve equality. So in that sense, I'm not claiming for my work to be final or exhaustive in any sense, but yeah, I mean, personally, I'm hoping for my next research project to look at things like perhaps religious authority in women's mosques. That these organizations are springing up in the United States. They're incredibly sort of potent right now, engaging a lot of a range of social justice issues. And so they may include women who don't cover their heads, women who wear the headscarf, and women who wear the niqab. And what about alliances between women regardless of their dress code? That's something that I would really be interested in exploring. And I think one of the groups really deserves a shout out. It's called Fitna. It's Fitna, Feminist Islamic Troublemakers of North America. And that's an incredible group that brings together women from different sort of ends of the spectrum and from different places in the spectrum, between progressive and conservative, and it builds alliances that address current issues. So I think that's something that really merits research attention to a large extent. And so alliances, I guess that's the next thing.
Okay, great. So I'm going to turn to Ahlam Muhtasib, a colleague of mine at Cal State San Bernardino. I'm going to allow to ask to speak. Ahlam, are you with us? Ahlam, are you with us? Professor Ahlam Muhtasib?
Oh, the mute was on?
No, now you could speak. We could hear you.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah. So thank you so much for the great presentation. And I'm just curious about your probably methodological approach to your interviewees. Like how did you sample your interviewees? I might have missed that because I was helping a student.
That's actually, thanks for the question. I don't think I talked about sampling, and that's a good question, and that structured the research to a large extent. So there is no association of women who choose to wear the niqab anywhere, and so the sample was very much purposive and snowballing. So basically, I had to contact organizations, and I went through my personal networks, and I looked for women online, and I basically took I invited every woman who wore the niqab full or part-time, and I also interviewed women who had taken off the niqab permanently. And so in that sense, we can't really talk about things like how representative the sample is, because we just don't have information about all the niqabi women in the United Kingdom, United States. And so, like a lot of qualitative research, it was purposive. I would like to think that the research strategy was inductive. So a lot of the time, the questions that I may have asked during interviews were generated by what the women said. And my research questions and my research sort of questions in the book also were guided by women who talked to me and who talked to me about their sort of main concerns. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, I think that the paradigm that this is known as is social constructivists, thinking about this as sort of socially constructed world and perspectives, and not trying to make this a positivist kind of project where I purport to be objective. It was very much dialogical and based on interaction of our positionalities.
I appreciate that. You didn't have to, like, I was not expecting a positivistic approach to research.
Yeah, of course.
And you're right, it's not easy really to find niqabi or hijabi women to interview. So I was just curious about how you went about finding them.
It was not easy for me as a non-Muslim, a woman who's quite obviously non-covered. I really needed help of many kind and generous people to put me in touch with niqabis and to vouch for me as a scholar who is not out to slander them or misrepresent them, but is just really keen to hear their voices. So that was a very big challenge for me.
Thank you, Ahlam. So I'm gonna turn to Rima Nashashibi. So Rima, and unmute. So go ahead, Rima.
Yeah, thank you for holding this this event. I have a couple of questions, a series of questions. One of them is that, did the respondents say that they were wearing a niqab because of their own free will? Was it peer pressure, or was it a patriarchal societal issue? One. Two, instead of wearing it to avoid sexual attacks, one, they are assuming first that they will be attacked. I mean, I need to understand, why do they assume that they will be attacked? Two, we need to address the root cause of that challenge or that issue, is that the need to teach respect for women and girls within and outside of the Muslim community, and to gender equity and gender equality. Do you want to address those two? Because I have two more questions.
Sure. So as far as the first question, all the women who I spoke to said they were wearing it out of their own free will. And in fact, a lot of them had to go against the wishes of their families, and several of them were disowned or silenced by their families who did not want them to wear the niqab, and for several reasons. So you could say that the whole discourse of women being forced is dishonest, because whereas the lack of those women in my sample doesn't mean that there are no such women globally who are forced to cover. The situation is just much more complex, and it appears to me that women who I spoke with, who represent at least a part of the Western niqabis, they do it for their personal reasons, and given the backlash they get, it's really a situation where you have to really be very sort of certain about your religious affiliations to do that, because it is to some extent a sacrifice, and it has a bearing socially on them, so they lose a lot of social capital in that sense. As far as the second question, I did not actually say that they wear the niqab to avoid sexual attacks or harassment. And in fact, a lot of them said that they were sexually harassed wearing the niqab or not wearing the niqab. So the niqab didn't really change much in that sense. They just said that they were more comfortable covering up, and that's kind of a different thing. And the references, the critique referred to the general gender relations in the West, where women are sexually objectified, and just turn on any TV channel or, you know, look at any adverts, you know, a half-naked woman is placed in so many adverts, you know, that, you know, I don't think that, like, we will disagree that with the women's bodies are used to sell things and to objectify. So yeah, they were aware of that distinction. You know, they knew that the niqab or hijab would not protect them from sexual harassment or attacks, but you know, at least they felt more comfortable being covered up personally.
So the third question, you answered it partially, is I just need to understand what's their rationale for wearing a niqab. It's not dictated to religiously. So what is their rationale? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand it. And four, in a Muslim/Arab public gathering, I heard it from various attendees at various functions, when only because of, you know, Muslim and Arab communities here, we were either targeted by the FBI or others. And there's a concern that how do we know who's behind the niqab? Is it a man? Is it a woman? Is it somebody from the community? Is it somebody from outside the community? So I'm just.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as far as the theological argument, and I'm not a theologian, so bear with me. The niqab, like I said, you know, the women were aware it's not dictated, as in is not an obligation.
It's not.
But I guess, you know, different people experience religion in very different ways, and not everybody feels like they need to only do what's the bare minimum. And very often they said, you know, the bare minimum is this, but I want to do something more. So they describe the niqab very often as an extra step. And so, you know, one of the arguments was in relation to religious experience and sort of an ethical disposition. Then the niqab increased their faith. And so it was just the niqab was their religious practice. It was like prayer for them. And some of them supplemented that with references to the Islamic history. And you know, there is a lot of debate about the hadith. Of course, the Quran does not mandate the niqab, but neither does it mandate the hijab. You know, it says about covering the bosom and being modest, but nowhere in the Quran is the hijab as the head covering actually mandated. So taking just the Quranic argument, we could say, so the hijab is not mandated either, but nobody is there are fewer counter arguments against the hijab. And, you know, the women refer to a lot of hadith where, you know, I think the one they really sort of spoke about a lot was a hadith where women from a tribe, you know, approached Muhammad and they covered up their faces with their aprons. And that kind of translated into practice. And so they said, you know, in the times of the prophets, some women did not cover their heads, some of them covered their faces. And, you know, Muhammad did not discourage that. So, you know, he allowed for a variety of these kind of religious practices according to whatever women were comfortable with. And so, yeah, so that's one. I don't know if that answers, I kind of relate to you what the participants said, really. The second question about people sort of assuming false identities, right? Did you say?
Yes.
Because niqab. So I'll give you a question as an example, sort of parallel example from my husband's research. My husband is researching the sanctuary movement. So people who were basically taken in by churches in the 80s. And today he spoke to somebody who said, you know, and there was this FBI agent who infiltrated the sanctuary movement and then you know, gave the details away and people were arrested. And, you know, so it was a man who just assumed a false identity. He didn't need any niqab to do this. So I think it's kind of an assumption that if you show your face, you will definitely be, you know, true and sincere. That's not true. You know, people infiltrate and they they can do it without the niqab. So to demonize the niqab as a tool of deception or tool of terrorists, I think it's kind of it's just yeah, insincere, I guess.
No, it's not. And it's a concern. It's not a concern.
Thank you, Rima. This is a great question about the surveillance that targets Arab and Muslim community. It's been a standard operating procedure after 9/11, where Muslim and Arab spaces have been hyper surveilled. The FBI have hired a large number of agents to infiltrate the Muslim community, to map the Muslim community. So we have the whole New York Police Department that map the Muslim community, cafes, gathering places, mosques, grocery store, and so on, which makes the whole discussions about the niqab and whether there is actually an FBI agent behind the niqab. It's within the realm of possibility, but that's, at least from my work on the surveillance, it's a much more pernicious infrastructure in there, with almost 15,000 new agents that have been hired and unleashed to surveil the Muslim community on a national level. So I could understand where the unease that is there in the Muslim community, and you could see both the discussions about the niqab also leading into the discussion about surveillance. Yeah. I'm gonna turn to Abdullah, is it? So I'm allow you to speak. Abdullah, are you with us now? Are you with us? You could ask your questions or your point that you wanted to raise. No? I guess it's...
I think she is muted. There's a little mute.
I asked to unmute and I'm muting. Are you with us? No?
She says, I don't think my mic is working, but I think she's muted because that little icon.
Ask to unmute. You could click to unmute if you are able, please. While we're waiting for you, there's another question. Does the scholar find a connection between the niqab and burqa and the political, economic, and financial stability of their hometowns, rather than to see it as cultural and religious, but as an impact of lack of security?
Could you read the question again?
Did the scholar, meaning did Anna, find a connection between the niqab and burqa and the political, economic, and financial stability of their hometowns, meaning the niqabi, burqa-wearing women, rather than see it as a cultural and religious expression? Rather, it's an impact of the lack of security. So here the assumption that Muslim women who are wearing the niqab or the burqa are wearing it for security reasons because of the lack of political, economic, social stability.
So that's a question that is, in a way, it's difficult for me to answer because a lot of my interviewees were, very spread around, and a lot of the time I spoke to them via Skype or Zoom, and so I might not even know where their hometown was, and that was much more the case. I usually knew that where the hometown was, but I wasn't that much of an expert about the particular state or the neighborhood. I can speak more to the British sample probably because I interviewed almost all the women in person, and a lot of them I interviewed. They were living in neighboring towns in an area of England that was indeed sort of economically challenged, but I'm not sure if that particular location had a bearing on what the women did, because Well, a lot of them did say that the niqab made them more comfortable going out and seeking employment. So a lot of them said, you know, if the niqab were to be banned in the UK, I would probably, you know, move away, or I would just sit at home. I would be shut off from society because I would not go out without my niqab. But as it is, they you know, they were like I said, they were teachers. One of them was a driving instructor. Somebody was a radio presenter, you know, and they were all very comfortable going out and engaging with the world. So in that sense, it was definitely like one of the sources that I quoted in my book said, you know, the niqab is a passport for these women to the outside world, to the world outside their home. So that actually enables them to comfortably, you know, engage in social interactions. But I would not say that the niqab added to their security. If anything, it made them more visible and therefore targeted much more by abusers. So it's complicated, but I think
maybe it's in a different settings outside the West. For example, maybe in, let's say, where it's in Afghanistan or other location, that maybe is the case, but not necessarily in the West, where you actually become the most visible target because you stand out.
Yeah, I'm quite clear that that the differences in contexts are huge, and you know, I've not done research with women living in Afghanistan, and I'm sure, you know, their situation is diametrically different, and the findings might be very different as well.
So we have back Abdullah. So are you able to speak right now? Can you unmute your mic?
Maybe she could just type the question.
She right. How one has to be on guard and a bit fearful when stepping out of the house. He said, using humor or kids to humanize myself. She actually is herself a niqabi wearing woman. Say, I'm just really glad to hear all these complicated experiences and emotions being given a voice. So she's just saying that she relates to what you have said. A lot of what was discussed today being made to feel like an alien in masjid Muslim communities as well as outside in secular societies. So she is actually also feeling to be almost otherwise and alien in mosques and Muslim communities. So it's actually in both spaces.
Well, one thing that she might also recognize is a positive thing. A lot of my respondents were adamant that they loved their niqab. You know, regardless of all the problems and challenges, they love the feel of the niqab. They like to feel it on their face, and they just wouldn't want to leave their house without it. So sometimes, you know, it's important to shift that perspective from something that, you know, is unpleasant or, you know, is weird. And they spoke with love about that garment. And I think that was really important to hear that, you know, it can be something good spiritually and in so many other ways. Also as a fashion accessory. I mean, these days with people covering up their faces, you know, the niqab can be really cool, I think.
Yeah, and she adds on, to be honest, it's part of me now, but it is at the day end a religious obligation. I do it out of love of God and not a love of the garment itself. So that's her statement at the end. So if there's any other questions that, or people raising their hands, Rima, are you wanting to ask another question? Because I see your hand. Ahlam, I see your hand again, so I'm going to ask Ahlam. Ahlam, are you back with us with a question?
Yes. Yes, I'm trying to figure out how to unmute every time.
And then I'll also ask Deborah. So go ahead, Ahlam.
So I have two questions, and one of them is scholarly because I'm a scholar. So of course, the methodology and the approach and all of these epistemological and ontological questions are important for me. And the second one is more of a critical question. So the methodological question is, how do you think that the location or the site of your interviews in the United Kingdom or in England and in the US would be different, if we are talking about other localities? Well, you mentioned a little bit Afghanistan, right? But maybe others, like North Africa, let's say, or the Levant, because we do have hijabis in those areas. Maybe the context is different though than—
You mean niqab, not hijab.
Sorry, the niqab, yes, or burqa, whatever they call it. And the other question is, the West has been very, very interested and very obsessed actually with the veiling and unveiling of Muslim women. And actually, this is a very important tool to weaponize, or, the niqab itself, the hijab actually in general, Muslim women in general, but also specifically the niqab in certain cases, have been actually weaponized to colonize. And we could talk about decolonization as a new project, as a modern contemporary one, like Afghanistan, for example, to an extent, Al-Iraq, but also, old, colonization projects across, the world, basically. So by writing this book and talking to these women, and, I admire, how truthful you are trying to get yourself out of the context, right? But how do you see that your book, your research is either a continuation in that direction or an antithesis to that direction in this discourse on veiling and unveiling Muslim women? Thank you.
So the first question that you asked, it's hard for me to answer because essentially the way I understand it, you're asking me about what would my findings be if I carried out a research project that I didn't carry out.
I guess the reason I asked that is because a very specific conclusion you mentioned, which is that all of your interviewees said that it was a choice, and that all of them said that they don't believe it is obligatory, but actually it's kind of like encouraged, or, it's a pious thing to do, etc. I guess that's the specific point I was interested in, because I bet others might not, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
and in a way, is this because they are in a Western country?
I think one important thing to consider is that women who agreed to speak to me, they were comfortable with their niqab and therefore they wanted to be a part of the research. Women who may have been forced, perhaps they wouldn't have the chance to be a part of the research for many reasons, but I don't know, because it's hard to theorize about, a theoretical subject or in format that never materialized to me. I thought I was looking in different places, so I didn't want to limit myself to just one site. I was, looking high and low for different voices. I didn't want to, for example, speak to just the niqabis who are very visible in the media. There are a few that are usually invited to studios or who speak out these days, at least. So I was hoping to get at least a spread of opinions. I don't want to say representative opinions again, but at least, seek them out from different places. And that, in a limited way, it is an answer. That's, I think for the majority of women in the West, widely conceived, it is their choice. And, we know for a fact that in other contexts, such as, Iran, where women are forced to wear the hijab, or, for a period of time, women were forced to wear the burqa under the Taliban. A lot of women who I spoke with were very critical of that. They were critical of a regime that forces a practice that, you know, if at all, you know, should come from the heart or from the inside, internally. And you know, it is, isn't it, you know, one of the hadith that said, Prophet Muhammad said, there is no compulsion in religion, or was it a verse from the Quran? I think it was a verse from the Quran.
From the Quran.
Yeah. So yeah, no compulsion in the religion. They quoted that quite a lot. So I mean, you know, there is definitely, you know, attention, you know, there needs to be attention to the context and, you know, different experiences of women. So I was very clear about, you know, what context I was doing the research in. The second question, the obsession with the veiling. I am aware that, you know, by writing yet another book about the Islamic dress code, it could be, you know, it could be placed in that stream of, you know, obsessive writing. But I was hoping that, you know, the fact that I was starting with the women, you know, made it sort of acceptable. And you know, I spoke to these women a lot, you know, about the research and why I'm doing it, and they seem to be very supportive of it. A lot of them said, you know, they feel silenced. They never have a chance to explain how they feel or what their motivations are, and they kind of, you know, they cheered me on, and I guess that's that was a sign for me that, you know, it's probably not entirely a bad thing, you know, and by signaling throughout the book that, you know, I'm aware of the colonial baggage that comes with veiling, and, you know, how colonial powers in, you know, in the 19th and 20th century used veiling as a sort of weapon, that how they weaponized it against local populations, and how women were forcibly deveiled. You know, all of that, you know, I'm signaling through the way. And yeah, I mean, you know, we can never escape the context. We can never escape the discourse. At the end of the day, you know, even if we oppose the discourse, we're still kind of in dialogue to it. So it's a really difficult, you know, question about, you know, where we should go next. It's a difficult question about representations. You know, who should we focus on? You know, can we speak for others who are marginalized? You know, what impact our voice will have, and, you know, should we leave it all to them? And, you know, I don't like to think that I'm finishing with the topic as the book is published. I kept in touch actually with a lot of women who I interviewed, and these days we do some collaborative work together. And you know, quite recently, you know, I worked with one of them, for example, to get her published in context of the British injunction to wear the masks. It's very recent, and so that particular niqabi wanted to say, you know, out there in public that, you know, this is so unfair, because, you know, masks are now being ordained, but just 2 years ago, Boris Johnson was making fun of us, and, you know, where's the consistency? And so, you know, she had that point to make. She wanted to make that argument, and, you know, I put her in touch with editors, and, you know, she's writing her piece. So fingers crossed, she will be able to get out there and publish her article in a big title. So, you know, I'm also sort of trying to use the privilege that I do have by virtue of being a scholar, you know, with a book out soon, you know, to not just push my own voice and kind of cut off the coupons, but, you know, actually, you know, give a platform or help with a platform, and, you know, I guess amplify those voices, not just through the book, but through other means that I might have as well.
Thank you. Last question. I'll ask Deborah. Go ahead. If you could ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. I wrote my question in the question box, so I'll just read it to you. And maybe this kind of follows up on what you were talking about. You talk about the importance of having these women's voices sort of centered in a way, and you mentioned dialogical that kind of language. And I'm wondering, this is maybe an old-fashioned question in some ways, but I'm wondering, when you went to write your book, did you think about that question of voicing in terms of your book as a kind of literary object? That is there, how do you stage this kind of voicing and the sort of intersubjective nature of the research process? Or do you just set that aside and say, it's enough, I'm doing this? I'm wondering about that, because I've been involved in sort of, for many years, with the whole subject of feminist ethnography, and whether, does it require some kind of autobiographical positioning? In other words, thinking about voicing in a literary sense of the term. How did you approach that in terms of writing the book, I guess would be my question.
So I guess throughout the book, I'm trying to be clear how my positionality and how my own experiences shaped it. Am I going in the right direction towards your question? Because it's sort of a complex question here. So I guess in some ways, I did consider the issue of, for example, the insider-outsider sort of binary, and to what extent we're different, me and my respondents, my participants, and is there anything that we might share, and is that of importance for the research? And sort of a little bit about my background. I'm ethnically, I'm a Polish national who did my PhD in the United Kingdom. I spent 10 years over there, and over the 10 years, I was studying and working. I was always very much an immigrant, not an expat. I was an immigrant who belonged to a very particular ethnic group that at the time in the United Kingdom sort of entered the country and created a bit of chaos and culturally and sort of in the labor market. And so, yeah, feelings were very mixed until they weren't towards Poles. And I think Brexit, the departure of the United Kingdom from the EU, was a very clear signal that we don't want the Poles, we don't want the Eastern Europeans. And what I'm trying to say here is that I did kind of experience the abjectness. I did experience some sort of otherizing, and it cannot be translated. I'm not trying here to say this was the same, but in some way, I think those women who I spoke with, they did recognize that I was not from there. I was not British. I was not a middle class researcher with a very British kind of distinguished accent. That we when they talked about an experience of being for example asked to go back to their own country, even though they were born in the United Kingdom and they were very British, they were so much more British than me, but they were asked to go back to their own country by harassers in the street. That's something that I was told as well. So we did kind of click at these points, and that was a very sort of interesting moment to think that there are those crossovers and moments of alliance, but at the same time I was very much aware that as long as at least as long as I don't open my mouth, I am able to pass to some extent, and just by walking down the street I will not be subject to harassment or racism. That generally I am safe, and these women who are visibly Muslim, they are not. So that's where I really had to work on my empathy and trying to imagine that, at the same time recognizing that I will never be able to see that. And one really sort of aspect that connects to that from the book is something that is quite a common journalistic practice, which I called niqab for a day, where a journalist puts on a niqab, a journalist who might be Muslim or not, and they just go out there and then, you know, they spend the day wearing the niqab and they come back and they write about their niqab experience. And I'm very critical of that because, you know, this is really just, you know, playing charades and playing something that they're not, and just going out there and experiencing some prejudice for a day is, you know, never going to reflect the true nature of the experience, you know, both in a negative way, but also in the positive way. So my argument is that they're never able to, these journalists, they're never able to represent the niqab experience sort of honestly. But yeah, I mean, of course, there's a limit in which I can represent their voices. But to be honest, you know, as long as we recognize those limits and don't make claims to be absolutely representative, to say it exactly as these women wanted to, you know, then I think, you know, then on those kind of shaky, uncertain terms, it's okay. And, you know, I don't know if that's kind of significant or not. I like to think that it is, but a lot of women who I shared my writings with like them, and they are very comfortable with them. So that's also a data point for me that, you know, I'm on a good course.
Thank you, Anna, for this conversation. Thanks all our audience for the really questions that sprung out more conversations and more discussions. Make sure to look for the book when it's out, Wearing the Niqab. It's important for us to continue to look for research and work that it's dealing and covering various areas of Muslim communities. And here this one deals with Muslim women wearing the niqab. I know there are some questions and comments about variety of issues. This was a conversation about a particular book, a particular research, and came out. And hopefully we'll have many other researchers as well as speakers that will be coming in August. So make sure that you continue to look out for what the Islamophobia Studies Center is doing, both for the rest of the summer as well as going into the fall. Thank you, Dr. Anna Piela, for enriching our conversation, for taking us into your own work. And we look forward to continue to cooperation for you and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Good night.